Leila, thank you for squeezing this piece in with me because I had done other interviews, but I'm like, oh, wait, Halloween is coming up and this is an issue per
Mhm.
se. Not even an issue is this is when people with highly intuitive children really run into some huge blocks or um, adventures, to say the least. And I felt that it was important for us to have a conversation about what that feels like, how we can help, and just different things pertaining to Halloween with highly intuitive children. Do you want to give us tell me what, like history wise, what you are feeling pertaining to Halloween or things you feel like we should know?
Sure. So, thank you for having me. And I actually, as an adult, I really enjoy Halloween. But when I was a kid, that wasn't always the case. And in terms of Halloween, I think it's important to point out that we have a long history with Halloween. And the reason that's important is because especially when you're focusing on healing or energy, or even if you have children that are highly intuitive and they see spirits or other beings or can tap into their family history. Halloween itself has a huge history and it goes back and way back in history. And I think it's important that we understand and know what the core of this holiday is based on because that affects us here and now. So in my family, we're Irish American. We have a little bit of other nationalities trickled in, but it's primarily Irish. And in Irish history, typically Halloween, or way back before the church was popular, it was recognized as Samhain. And Samhain is not only a celebration of us moving from one season into another season, but it's moving from light into dark. And it has to do, I mean, very specifically, it has to do with the veils coming together and essentially the dead walks the earth. So it's a moment where you can revisit your ancestors and your imprints with your ancestors, but it's also a moment where darkness can be walking the earth, where everything that's spiritual that normally keeps tucked away, regardless of what you believe, the gods, the demigods, the elves, the gnomes, the leprechaun, everything kind of can be out and about. Over time, that's of course changed. There's connections to the Greek history, which they believe was also a celebration for the dead. And in later times, it became connected with the church, which became All Saints' Day, which was another way of honoring those that had passed. And then we move even further, and it's moving more into what we acknowledge as Halloween today. The reason I think that it's important to have that understanding as a parent is it's kind of like imprinted within you, within your DNA. It's something that's really ancient to society. And whether you acknowledge it here and now, there's a piece of you or a part of your DNA that acknowledges that for years and years and years and years, this was a major point where you did celebrate or acknowledge the spiritual. And it's kind of like the viewpoint of the intuitive knowledge to know that when you sense or see a snake that you should be scared. No one has to be told that they should be scared of a snake. And the belief is that that's imprinted very deeply within your system. That's your survival intuition. That's based on your evolution. You had to avoid that snake or that predator to survive. And my thinking is with Halloween, it's been around for such a long time that there's a piece of us that is aware that whether it's true or not, that's the moment where the spiritual world comes together with the physical world.
When you're talking about coming together, does it literally mean on that day, or is it over several days, or?
So it depends which history or religion that you acknowledge. Of course, you know, like me in the here and now, I acknowledge that the spiritual world is around you all the time. But there are a lot of people and a lot of children that have experiences leading up to the day of Halloween and a few days after. And there are references in history where it was a multi-day celebration. So some of the Celtic references said it was bonfires for 2 or 3 nights, whereas later on it became one night and one night only.
So for you, was it in the past, I guess, do you feel like it led up to, and I'm just asking you this because I have, we have our own experiences here, especially when you were younger, did you feel like it intensified as you got closer to the day? And when I say intensify, I guess it would be either seeing spirit, feeling spirit, energy kick up, activity in your house pick up, and any of that.
So I definitely felt like when I was younger, I definitely felt like my anxiety would always pick up.
Yeah.
There was also a level of excitement, but it was very evident. Like I can remember that I used to be very afraid of autumn, and it gets darker a lot sooner. And for me as a child, a lot of the activity that I would experience was in the dark.
Yeah.
It's when things became dark. It's when the house settled down. It's when things became quiet. So, of course, leading up to Halloween, there's a big anxiety rush for me as a child. There was, because if you just even look at the situation logically, um, like I said, it's getting darker sooner. In terms of Halloween, when I was younger, I really, really struggled with it. My parents kind of had to really work with me. I had major, major anxiety, like trick or treating, being out there. I really felt that some of the things that I was seeing weren't people. Like I couldn't discern. And I think this is a common issue. When you have extreme abilities or intuitive abilities, you're uncertain as to what you're looking at and not looking at. And as a child, I definitely had fear. Like I was totally the child that had to keep a hold of my parents' hands through the whole process because I wasn't sure if I was really seeing someone dressed up as, you know, a ghoul or if I was really seeing a ghoul. Of course, there were moments where it was very obvious, but as a child, I really struggled with that. And they worked hard to find compromises with me. So I think if I had had it my way, I probably wouldn't have trick or treated at all when I was younger. But my parents were really good about, okay, well, let's see if we can do just 5 houses or just this street. Usually they took us off the farm, the farming area, because that was extremely dark and you had to walk further between houses, and they would take us to like a friend's house where it was more populated, there was more light. And that was literally how we approached it, is let's do 5 houses, 8 houses, let's do this street. Yeah.
We had here with Dominic, um, and I would say since little, like he really truly wanted to do Halloween. Like he wanted to dress up. It was difficult for us to, with all the sensory stuff, just being unable to wear anything or not understanding why can't we go Halloween trick or treating in our underwear? Like I want to participate. Isn't that good enough? Um, and lots of breakdowns leading up, days, weeks before. And I would also say in certain years, even it felt like attacks um, hitting him one after the other. Then what else would happen would be, we would have to avoid driving past certain houses that were decorated in certain ways. I don't think that's uncommon for kids to be scared. And for several years, even up till last year, he would say that he just wouldn't go and he was going to stay at his grandparents' house. And right as we would leave his grandparents' house, he would ask if I even bought his costume, and I'd always keep
Mm.
it in the trunk. I'd always buy it and keep it in the trunk, even if he never would ever go trick-or-treating, but he always did. Um, once I found once he was in with a bunch of kids, we were there the whole time, that he would get kind of in the flow of fun and energy, and being so empathic, he kind of could ride that. Um, and he would, run just as fast as the other kids. But there were, for him, he would run in happiness, get past one house, and then you could see him mentally breaking down for a minute and then shoot back right up. And
Mm.
I mean, for other parents, they don't really understand, but you get to a point where you're like, stop explaining. Um, and there it was interesting how much he would stuff down. Like if we went to a house with really scary decorations, he'd either not go, or if it caught him off guard, um, there would be melting down. But then as the kids ran away, he would try and pick back up. Um, and then at the end of the night, it got better as the years went by, but there was a total solid crash that would happen. Um, I think also too, being in the dark as a young child, especially children now who aren't used to like being in open dark all the time, there's something unknown and scary about being that vulnerable. I mean, I think when I was a kid, we had that more. We had that more of that ability to do that, and we did it more often than kids nowadays. Um, but I noticed they don't want to like be in the camping tent because the expanse of dark, and there being anything can get to them. I noticed they have a lot more anxiety around that than we do. Yeah. So that's what I've noticed on the mother end.
Yeah, and there's the over sensory is a common complaint, both in dressing up, but also just having to be out with kids you don't know, adults you don't know, the decorations, the lights, all of that accumulates and adds to what your spiritual abilities are. So I've heard that before. For me as a child, I only had one moment where I can very clearly remember. My mom was also very creative, and I have a couple other parents who have tried this. So in terms of like kids that have issues with like certain cloths touching their skin, what they try to do is get creative with the cloth that they do like. So if
Yeah.
they have like old dresses, or I have one of the little girls that I see, she really only likes cotton touching her skin. They use some of the old outfits and try to patch them together to make the different costume and dye them different colors and stuff like that. My mom, she actually would sew our costumes. So, and she always tried to find a costume that was a pair with my sister. So my sister and I had a reason to go together if we were
Yeah.
scared. But I do remember one year I begged and begged and begged to be Catwoman. And my mom made this fantastic outfit, but she made it according to a pattern. And I made her life awful because as soon as I put it on, it was
Yeah.
so uncomfortable. And then the anxiety of having to go out
Yeah.
and wear it when I'm already uncomfortable. And I remember just bawling and crying and crying and crying. It was too much. So, and back in those days, I don't know if you still do this, but back in those days, you also had a Halloween at school. So you would
Yeah.
have to get dressed at school as well.
Yeah.
And that was extremely stressful for me to have to dress up in front of my peers, handle getting an outfit on by myself that I'm already uncomfortable in, that isn't in a situation I'm uncomfortable in.
Yeah. That's huge. I
Right.
we I would I had the luxury, thank God, of a preschool that even though that they didn't know what was going on with Dominic, they were open. to whatever I wanted, how I wanted to help the situation. So grateful for that.
Mm,
But they allowed me to come in and help him, because putting on the wrong shoe, not even the wrong shoe, putting on a shoe that doesn't fit right, for instance, um, can trigger a whole thing. Like
yep,
they can go down a dark place. And so Halloween costume is no different. And taking the time and being somebody who knows the ins and out of that, because there really is no sucking it up.
right,
Um, there isn't. And so yes, and also too, the masks. I thought, first thought you'd think like masks with that, it would kind of make, which it still might, a child who's super sensitive, like to feel covered. But no, like it would create panic attacks, because it would be like, you can't smell the inside of this mask. This stuff's gonna kill me.
right.
And um it can't touch here, and the smell's wrong, and the this and the that.
And I've heard both in that scenario. So
Yeah.
I've had
Yeah.
children who put a mask on or a face covering and then they don't want to take it off
Yeah.
because they feel like they finally get to be the scary thing, or they have more power and control being hidden. But then I see the other side too, and I'm more closer to how Dominic is, where it's like you can't deal with it. Like it doesn't
Yeah.
feel right. It's going up against your skin. It smells wrong. Even like when you touch it, your hands of what it's sensing.
Yeah.
Um, the intuitive children are they're fighting a lot of times to stay in their body. So when something doesn't feel like the way it should, it can be very jarring to an intuitive child. So even just touching the outside of a mask and the contours being different, for some of the children, that sends them into a downward spiral, because it's the idea that that's not their face, that's not them.
Yeah.
Um, and I also have children that have a they come in with a very acute sense of right and wrong and do not lie, always tell the truth.
Yeah.
This is very common with intuitive children. They constantly are saying the truth. They do not understand why you can't just walk up to someone and say they look old and what
Yeah.
they're doing isn't right. And
I got
um,
one of those.
right. And so I've also had children where like they can't wear a costume because um
It's
it's
not the
going
truth.
yes, it's going against that internal battle of I must always be truthful, I must be who I am, I must say what I see that doesn't make sense or feels wrong to me.
Yeah. There's a lot of, on a parent side too, you're going to get, for me, I got tested a lot on how important things were. For instance, there is the expectation, or I mean, expectation feels a little harsh. I don't think it's like as dire or um in stone, but that, that you take your kids to see all the relatives before they go trick or treating, that you are the one schlepping the kids to each relative's house so they can experience them. Well, over through the years, I've had to let a lot of that go.
Hmm.
Um, and really, just I have to cut stops out, because the thing is that it made the anxiety kick up even further, and we wouldn't even get into Halloween because we're in the car with maybe the costume touching, maybe he has to take it off, and maybe um then put it back on, so you're going through the whole trauma of putting it back on. And then also too, there's things that you should be saying to an adult and not saying to an adult, and how long you're supposed to stay. And we're in a different atmosphere of different houses inside, one after the other. And it was a frying situation. I was big time setting us up to destroy Halloween
Mm.
in all
And
forms.
let alone if they see something in each house, because that's the advantage to
Yeah.
trick-or-treating when you have abilities, is if you can get over that fear, you're still getting that over sensory, but the advantage is you can go to all these people's houses and not actually be in the house.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yep.
So it's like almost like peekaboo with your abilities. And there's not an obligation to stay. There's not an obligation. So it's almost like your abilities peek out for a moment and then they go back in, and they peek out for a moment and they go back in. And that's later. So like I experienced that when I was a teenager, and I've had other teens tell me that. But when you actually have to go into individual houses or Halloween parties, so that becomes
Yeah.
popular in the teenage years, and you're going to different parties, that's again, like you're saying, a whole different ball game, because someone's living space is totally different than being outside. And when you have abilities, it can be very overwhelming between what the family's just emotionally and spiritually going through in that moment, let alone if that house actually has residents that you can't see, we'll say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know about, well, I have a feeling that you are, going into other people's houses in general. Um, there's just a lot of download that goes on.
Yep.
I mean, from the second you walk in, just the smell, the feel, the consistency, when I know for me personally, but I know that Dominic does this for sure, is you're looking, on your own survival tactic, you're looking at everything going on and trying to process, well, why do they line up their books that way? And why do they have these pets? Even if, for instance, like, why do you have a dog that wants to bite kids, but you refuse to put it away? And that sounds ridiculous, but like literally that happens. Or, why do you have this that way? Why is your trash can over there and not over here? And there's just you can't even help it. There's a whole processing that goes through.
Yeah, even typically, and this is like, I think we mentioned this in a previous podcast, is subconsciously that happens for everyone on some level.
Right.
Then when you have an intuitive child, it happens in a more conscious manner, and you can't stop it. And then on top of that, you're getting feelings, and also reading what you can't see in addition. So it's like this huge overload, and as you said, a huge download. And then when you pair Halloween with it, and that popped in my head as you were talking, is keep in mind now, that's the one night where you having abilities is acceptable, and everyone's joking about it and talking about it, and they're making jokes about, ooh, something's gonna get you, and that heightens the adrenaline. And it also, the downside to that is it also makes it very realistic how different you are, because it's not one day a year for you. It's not a joke for you as an intuitive child or a parent of an intuitive child. This is your everyday. But here it is on this day of the year, everyone is talking about it and acknowledging it. And come tomorrow morning, we'll all be back to normal.
Right.
Right.
Right. I also too, I this isn't necessarily a Halloween thing to say,
Mm.
but I think I've been thinking about this lately, well, the last few months, is there's all these clairs that everyone talks about, clair, let's say clairvoyant, being able to see,
Yeah,
clair.
there's 5.
Okay, well, you know what? Let's not let me do it. Let's let you do it. Okay, do the 5 clairs. Then I'll go
Well, now
back
I
to my
gotta
thought.
see if I can remember them. This is way back when. So you have sentence, you have clairvoyance, clairaudience, and there's 2 more, but it's one for each sense, and you're using it in the spiritual way. So we might have to look that one up.
No, so it's
But there
clair.
are 5 clairs,
There's people on the other end of this podcast losing their mind that
right?
they're like, they don't even know what they're talking about. It's just that it's not that we don't know what you're talking about. It's that we realize
Don't use it
we
because it's
don't use it because
common.
it's so mishmashed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's everything. So claircognizant is just clear
Yes.
knowing. So you know.
So that was the one I was
Sentient
missing.
is clear feeling. So that's like an empath. Clairaudient is being able to hear.
Yep.
Clairvoyant is being able to see.
Mm-hmm.
Is clairvoyant also too, it makes me want to think of a medium. But the thing with mediums is they can see in the third eye, in your
Yeah.
mind's eye, but there are mediums, and not just mediums. It's not just seeing the people who've passed on, but can see with their actual eyes. That
Yes.
also can,
And
right?
that's where it gets really blurry because the highly intuitive children, like in my case, I see with my physical eyes.
Right.
So it took me a long time to discern what is energy and what is physical. Whereas a lot of people were not seeing what I was seeing. But then there are people who see from their third eye. My understanding of the five clairs, which we still didn't even get to the
Now we
fifth
got one
one.
more, which is clear. It's tasting. It's tasting resource. Where I was going with that is I remember for a while thinking being clairsentient, being able to feel everything, everybody's stuff, being able to feel things and not be able to know that, not being able to see this, that was like the worst Claire to really have as something that was more, that was the strongest out of all your abilities, right?
Mm-hmm.
That could be the absolute worst, right? Because you have to feel everything. Then I really started thinking about it over the last few months, how terrifying it would be to walk into a building and see spirit with your eyes doing whatever they're doing, right? In whatever state that they're in, whether, let's say, they're in a very dense, dark, depressive state or dismembered, and how scary that would be. And then also to be clairaudient and hear things. Somebody's talking to you. Well, that's going to make you think that you're nuts.
Right.
And because nobody else is hearing it. And claircognizant, just knowing, how do you know that? What if what if you know something that you do not want to know, whether it be a disaster or something that it's going to happen within your family? Not saying it has to be a premonition, but,
And what if you have all of them?
and this is what most people, I don't even say most people, but people who aren't as educated is not the word, but in this world, is that there, you have all these different pieces and they work all the time. This is why we don't know all the clairs, because it's like breathing and feeling your foot and brushing your hair and tasting vanilla on your breath. Like, they're all there working together, doing things.
Yeah, and with the children that I work with, I actually feel, which I'll read you what's in this book, but I actually feel like it's a huge disservice. Um, and I know you, as a parent, I have talked to you about this before. It is a huge disservice to label things,
Yeah.
to tell a child that they only see spirit or they only feel spirit. It's a good tool to help you understand what's going on, but when you really deal with a child that's intuitive, depending on what it is, it will hit them completely different. And plus, they're evolving. So you may have a whole year where all they are is seeing things, but
Yeah.
then suddenly they flip and they're just hearing things. And in reality, all of these abilities come forward in an intuitive and gifted individual. It's just a matter of when and whether they're going to be acknowledged. And that's the other end of that, is a lot of times we are hearing things, but we disregard it, or we think, oh man, why did I think that? And we try to push it away. A lot of times we do know things and we go, oh, that's silly. I shouldn't have, I don't know where that's coming from. That must be from someone else, or because I watched a movie, or because, I heard someone talking about this a couple weeks ago. And so the reality is all these different clairs are hitting us all the time. And for me, I don't use them that often because I don't normally separate them out.
Yeah.
Um, I'm wishing I did now in this particular podcast so that I could be more specific. But the reality of me working with kids on a daily basis, it is very rare that I will look at a child and say, okay, this is clairsentience or clairvoyance or clair, I don't bother. But you can get courses that will help you understand, and you can look it up online. There are 5 clairs total. In this particular book, they only reference 3, which is clairvoyance, which is clear vision, clairaudience, which is clear hearing, and clairsentience, which I always say wrong, clairsentience, which is clear feeling or knowing.
Yeah. And I think there's cognizance, and then the one where you can smell and taste,
Right.
which I don't know which one it is. Claire,
But
smell and
I
taste.
do think this, I do want to say this just to, there's a quote in here. One of the things that's fascinating about this series, again, this is called the Spiritual, Speaking to Spirit edition, and it's a whole workbook set. And like I said, it takes the scariness out of all your spiritual abilities, and it makes it very grounded. And one of the ways it does this is it connects it to very real people and from our time. And so it has different stories about like Thomas Edison and current people who have mentioned using their spiritual abilities to move them forward in our society. There's a quote here by Walt Disney, and it says, "Somehow I can't believe that there are any heights that can't be scaled by a man who knows the secret of making dreams come true. This special secret, it seems to me, can be summarized in the 4 C's." Okay, and then he goes on to say their curiosity, confidence, courage, and consistency or constancy. And but they're referencing how when you look at that from a spiritual point of view, it can also be a reference to the clairs, because using your creative energy gets you in contact with your spiritual or the energetic side of things. So we kind of went on a tangent there. I apologize.
Totally. Right.
But that is the reality. It's not something, when you're living it, that's not really something that you go seeking or looking for, because you're getting hit by all of them usually. And each one of your children, as well as yourself, have experienced a different clair at different points. When you're looking for more information, though, and seeking to understand, that's where you'll run into that. But on the actual daily usage, there's not much benefit to separating them, in my opinion, because what it comes down to really is empowerment and figuring out what is physical, what is energetic, what is emotional, what is mental, and figuring out what to do with each one of those experiences, and what's outer and what's inner, which is how I work with children.
So, do you have any stories of Halloween at all, other than that you want to discuss, or any specific event?
Well, what I would say is, you referenced earlier that when Dominic had a group of friends, things could get a little bit easier and he could have more grace with the evening. And that's kind of the evolution that I went through. And the flip side of that is, I can remember very vividly when I was younger, I would see things that I was pretty sure I shouldn't be seeing. So I saw things on a regular basis, but what bothered me about on Halloween was that I was seeing them among people. So when I was younger and I would get visited by spirits or see spirits, however you want to phrase it, it was typically when, me and my sister are sleeping alone in the dark. They're on the outside of the house or they're wandering through the house. Sometimes they're aware of me, but sometimes they were just wandering. I was just seeing them wander or seeing them stand outside the window or look in. What bothered me on Halloween is, I don't know in hindsight if it's because so many people believe it, if it's our historical background, or if it's just because I was more open to it. What bothered me on Halloween is they were interacting and walking with people. And I can vividly remember that. And I knew if I said something out loud, people would say to me, no, it's just someone in costume. But I also had moments, like even in my mind, I can remember seeing a being that was small and red, that had kind of animalistic features, that was walking among people. And it really scared me. When I got older and I found a peer group that I really liked, one of the benefits of having that peer group was I felt like I could put my focus on, and I don't know if this is better or worse, but I could put my focus more on what I was feeling with my peer group than what was happening on the outside. And so those scary things that I was seeing amongst people walking around, or the spirits and everything like that, that kind of got pushed to the side, because where my abilities were more focused as a teenager was on my peer group, what I was feeling and the dynamics in the relationships. And yeah, it was creepy, but we were all creeped out. It was like a different type of adrenaline. And as long as I got myself in a place where I was comfortable, I think I was like Princess Leia 3 years in a row, because all you had to wear was a cotton robe and a little rope belt. So like there wasn't a whole lot involved for that one. But as long as I got myself in a place of comfort, I was good to go. And those were the few Halloweens where I really enjoyed it. But I too would crash at the end. And I often would go to sleep either crying or feeling depressed. And I have read, this is me just adding information that I have gotten. I do not have knowledge from other parents other than what you've mentioned, and I do not have an actual professional viewpoint on this. But I have read recently that psychologically there's such a buildup that you should have fun that night
Oh,
and excitement.
yes.
And when it doesn't live up to what you're like, even if it does live up to being the best night, it'll still never reach that point of what society thinks that night should be. And so
Yes.
your brain goes through, and your brain and body go through a huge process of letdown, basically.
Yes. I was literally thinking this before you said it.
Mm.
Um, because I was like thinking about what the end of the night, what the issue is at the end of the night. And it is the letdown, but literally it's a letdown. And that sounds ridiculous, but it happens here for birthday parties.
Mm.
And the thing is, the letdown can even happen before the party is over. And there's a lot of shame around that. For Dominic, for instance, is he wants to leave early because of the anxiety that he's experiencing, or wants people to leave early because of his anxiety. And then he thinks he's the contributing factor in it being a letdown.
Mm.
Um, Actually, we experience it oftentimes, in Christmas, like pretty much almost everything. Um, and, to a lot of people, it can look like a spoiled brat thing. Um, Even though it looks way more extreme than that.
Mm.
But no, there's like this mourning that happens or something.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're actually describing a couple things, and this I can attest to personally and professionally. So there's definitely the letdown, the guilt and the shame of partaking in that, and adding to the experience. That's not wrong, but it's not right. If your child has a hint of how energy works, whether he can or she can consciously express it, energetically, every person we meet and every experience we have, we are giving energy as well as taking in energy. And so, in a very real way, you partake in that. And in a very real way, you can, from an energetic standpoint or a spiritual standpoint, you can contribute to whether it's a letdown or not a letdown. Now, psychologically, that's a whole different ball game. And then when you add on top of that, if they have abilities where they can see the future. So this is a very tricky one, but I think it's important we cover it. The thing is, like, if they can see the future and it's going to be a really fun party, what happens for a child and even an adult that has abilities is they start experiencing the emotions way before they even get to the party.
Mm-hmm.
And then they experience the grief of having to say goodbye before the party's even over,
Yes.
because where they're focused is in the future. This is the same thing with death. A lot of children that have abilities can know and sense when someone's going to die or if they're sick way in advance. I mean, sometimes years in advance. And they will start grieving and going through the process of grief and letting go years in advance. And what's being said and expressed makes absolutely no sense to anyone. Even if they try to say to you, you're going to be dying, and I can't handle it, they're
Yeah.
going through a whole process of grief that's way, way in advance. And then psychologically, they then have to deal with the fact that when that person actually dies, everyone else around them is totally enmeshed in grief as if it's fresh and new, and they're through it.
I have a question about this because we talk about time a good bit and the idea that the past, the present, and the future are all going at the same time, right? And so the idea that currently Tara, me, is being born right in this moment, but also dying right in this moment. Do you have a feeling, and I'm just going by my own, is that oftentimes I try to steer away from that question with my own kids because I know with Dominic is that I'll lose him. And this may not make sense to somebody listening unless you have the context for it, but he's literally going down to the path to experience and live that memory or that, I don't know if we're talking about the future, what would it be? Not a memory.
It can be considered a memory.
Okay, so a memory. So literally go to that time and space when I'm dying
Mm-hmm.
and live it, experience it, feel it. And once again, this concept may not make sense to you to listen, but it does happen. Um, and so it's a weird it can be also a blessing at times because I'm not dead and I am here and we can have those conversations around it. But I think oftentimes me also because it's been happening here is that you sit there as a parent and you're like, well, it's not happening and I am here now. And you do want them to be in the present, but you do also have the opportunity to work through the grief with them in a way, if they're coherent, because sometimes for us they're not. He's not coherent. Eve hasn't gotten to the point where she's not coherent. Thoughts?
Well, it's also dependent on age range. So this is a perfect example of why I don't focus on the Claires, because where the emphasis should be is feeling empowered by it. So if he knows he can go down that road, I would rather him go down that road when he chooses, when he has the sacred space to be able to do that. When you're in a point where you can have a conversation with him. And it's less about his ability to do it. That's not the emphasis. It's more about having the support and the understanding to be able to cope with it, but also to be at a point where you can make the choice versus being the victim of your abilities. Um, and as when you get into the teenage years, that's where I would really start exploring that ability. And you and I have talked about this and exploring time, and that's because your development is in a different place. But also as a parent, you can have more in-depth conversations. They have a more understanding of the world around them, and you can approach it in a very grounded way as a parent if you're able. You know, you can approach it saying, okay, well, this is what it's going to look like if I pass away. Here's what's in place. Here's what's not in place. Here's how you cope with grief. Here's what my experience was with grief. With a child, that's a little bit more difficult. Although I will say most intuitive children tend to be way more intellectually mature than what they're supposed. So with some children you can have those conversations with, but yes, then it becomes about trying to keep them in the moment until you're in a space that will allow you to have that experience together, and keep it sacred and keep it, I don't want to say controlled, but in a supported place. As a child, that's not only always easy because they get lost in that emotion and that experience, and it's hard to get them out of it, and it's hard to get them back to here and now, and it's hard to get them back to feeling their body and seeing mommy here and seeing daddy here. However, every time an intuitive child goes through one of these experiences, whether it's past or future, ultimately what they're doing is they're gaining knowledge and information to be able to handle situations here. And that's another tricky part of an intuitive child is some children cope in the moment, but for intuitive children, sometimes the way they learn how to cope is looking into the past or looking into the future, figuring out what they did wrong or what they did right, or seeing how others are reacting in the future or the past and learning from that. Is that necessarily the best way? I'm not sure. It can be just as traumatic as having to go through it in the moment and not having coping mechanisms and developing them as you go. But some children intuitively are using those abilities to get more knowledge so that they have more understanding in the here and now.
Okay. I have, uh, let's talk about, we have some time. Let's talk about movies pertaining to death, children's movies,
Okay.
because we started talking
I
about,
thought we were going to do Halloween movies, and I was like, I got some.
we can talk, that's what I mean, death or AKA Halloween slash death, anything circling around that, you know what I
Okay.
mean?
Okay.
Over here, Eve had like the age of 2 had an obsession with Coraline that we watched a whole bunch. I don't know if you've watched Coraline. And then
Yep.
we were talking about Coco earlier.
Yep.
Um, I can just give you the synopsis. I think it was Eve and Dominic had an obsession with Coraline. That was, and if you've watched this movie, Coraline, it's interesting because Coraline is in the here and now. She moves to a new house and she's kind of like got a chip on her shoulder. And she gets led down this door that only somehow she can see, and her parent, or is only opens to her and not her parents. And then she thinks her life here is pretty dumb, and she keeps crossing over into this other world where there's another mother who supposedly has a very lovely lovely, the life is good, the food, there's food, she gets to wear the clothes she wants, it's fun, but there's always something off. And I mean, my kids watched that over and over and over and over again and tore that movie apart, asking every question. I mean, that's not exactly a Halloween movie, but
No, but it's up there. That
yeah.
movie actually legitimately creeped me out when I saw that in college, and I remember being so creeped out. And I'm a huge Burton fan, so and that got like moved on my list of like one of my least favorites because it genuinely creeped me out. That it was like an alternate dimension with a mother who seemed perfect but really wasn't, and everything seemed like it was ideal but it really wasn't. um
One thing for us that I really liked was that it really does teach like the grass isn't always greener on the other side. You know
mm,
what I mean? And that you can create, in a weird way, you can kind of create that illusion.
yep.
And it does touch on the idea of like trusting your gut.
Yes, it
and
does. Yep.
trusting your intuition. Then there's those crazy ladies that live downstairs and they like read tea leaves and stuff.
Mm.
Um, and not that I've ever read tea leaves. It's not that as much as it's like trust when things are off, like there's a, follow that.
Right.
Um, what Halloween slash death-ish movie would you bring up?
Well, one thing that I would say is it's very common for intuitive children to find inspiration in TV shows and movies because
Yes.
it's a degree removed,
Yes.
and they can see the like a reflection basically aspects that they're experiencing. But it also, I've had this, so parents, don't be afraid to show some of these movies to your kids, because I've had parents that are like, oh, with their abilities, I'm nervous about this, because I've had a couple children, and myself included, where they're feeling stuck with a particular energy or a particular issue, and they watch a movie and they watch a character in a movie deal with a similar issue, and suddenly they're inspired and they figure out, this is what I need to do, or
Yeah.
I can approach it this way. Okay. And they get over whatever the block is that's bothering them, whether they're conscious of it or not. Sometimes it can be very, very inspiring. um,
Yes, I watch that constantly. And I don't know if anybody else goes through this, but there will be a solid, say, um, let's just say Star Wars, and we could do a whole podcast on
you
Star
could, I
Wars.
love
We could
Star
do a
Wars.
whole podcast. I'm not going down that road. However, I'm just going to say that what happened here was it was watched a bazillion times, and then every other episode of every um pertaining to that, not necessarily Star Wars, was watched, and then it was pulled apart and asked questions. And I watch my kids. It's a scene is plays and it's rewound 4, 5, 6 times, and then it's the questions are asked. Well, why is this happening? I don't think that is a good idea, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's very current for me. I mean, that's one of the ways Dominic and I connected. But
Yeah.
um, I, the newest Star Wars movie came out at a time when I really needed inspiration, and that's exactly what I did. I think I went to the theater and watched it 6 or 7 times, and as soon as it was out on digital, that's exactly what I sat there and did one night. And luckily, my mom enjoys Star Wars too, so we were able to enjoy it together. But it was rewinding certain things and stopping and talking and discussing certain things, and why certain things happen, and how would that really look in the energetic world, and what can you do with that information.
Yep.
Oh
All right.
man, Star Wars we can go to town on.
No, don't go there. Go down that hole. All right, give me a movie.
Well, do you want to discuss Coco?
Yes, let's discuss Coco.
Okay. Do you want to discuss what I mentioned earlier, or would you prefer to?
I'll start and give my perspective, and then you come in and give your perspective.
Okay.
We had an issue with Coco, and Coco is not allowed to be played over here, not because of a parent cutting it off. The children have decided Coco is never to be played here ever, ever. Every neighborhood child that has come through here, and I've asked them about Coco because I can't help myself, has said, I don't ever want to see that movie ever again, which blows my mind, right? I love the music's wonderful. I'm from Latin culture, so that it hits a lot of points. It reminds me of my great grandparents, like a lot.
Mm.
However, I know exactly what they're talking about. There is that scene, I'm going to spoil it, where they are in the spirit world, and the father, who he doesn't know he's his father, they meet an old man, and they're discussing how if whoever in the physical world forgets this old man and doesn't put his photo up in the Day of the Dead, that he will disappear ultimately, which he does right in front of their eyes. And they ask, where does he go? And there's no answer. He just goes. And we had seen this in the movie theater with some people, and a child in our group literally got up and left, hysterically crying, which then in turn left other children um, starting this situation. And the fear of not knowing, especially, I'm not saying you have to have religion, but religion does serve its case, as in like gives some kind of explanation for you to hold on to, even if it's not what you really truly feel is correct. It was just left too open-ended and made you feel very vulnerable in death, in that it's just over.
Mm.
So that is what has why Coco. No, I'd be like, let's play Coco, and they'd be like, don't ever say that name ever again. I'm like, it's a beautiful movie. So your thoughts?
Okay. So I have a couple thoughts. The first thought that you and I discussed prior to recording was the idea that someone really only exists after death in memory and legacy. And so if you aren't remembered and there is no legacy and you are forgotten, then that's it. You cease to exist. And that was kind of how I interpreted Coco, was that it was really about remembering Father for who Father really was, and remembering your ancestors. And where we were going with that was talking about how a lot of ancient cultures really took the time to honor their dead and encourage their ancestors and their dead to be a part of their physical life. And in our current times, there are cultures that do that, but unfortunately, a lot of times it's very misunderstood by others. The Hispanic culture, especially, they're very much honoring their dead and honoring their legacies and honoring their ancestors and keeping them very much alive and part of their everyday life. Some of the Celtic and the Norse cultures that are alive today, some of them acknowledge that as well. And there's actually, I'm not sure if this is a Jewish holiday. We recognized it in my family, but there is a day where you actually set a dinner plate and load it with food, and you keep the chair empty for the ancestors that want to come and eat with you. And I do think that that is acknowledged in either the Jewish or the Catholic religion as well, but I think they're different days. In our family, we acknowledged it in a totally separate, it didn't align with religious holidays. So there are cultures that still do that. But where I would continue now after hearing you talk about it again is also, and this is very apparent for intuitive children, you'll hear this brought up over and over again if you are, if you have a child that's intuitive, is the issue of the unknown and death. It's always at the forefront of conversation. And it's their brain trying to understand what they're experiencing and seeing on a regular basis. And it's a very tricky and complex and yet simple thing to understand. And I don't know how in depth you want me to go, because I know we're running out of time. But what I will say is there's an evolution in understanding the spiritual world that will happen for an intuitive child if they are learning how to cope and deal with their abilities. The unknown becomes known, but it doesn't necessarily become known as in what you would think it becomes known as. You don't have a knowing of like, oh, okay, well, this is where I'm going to go. I'm going to go through this gate and sit in this chair, and this is how it's going to be. The evolution is more broad than that. There's a knowing. You hit a point of enlightenment or understanding as an intuitive, it's much more simple. It all has to do with energy. And you go through this whole evolution of dealing with death in a mental, emotional, a spiritual, a physical, and going through all these different layers of grief, as you know, as you're watching with your children. It's this huge evolution of having to deal with the unknown and death. That is truly what the spiritual journey is, and everything that your children are contending with.
I have a question about the plate on the table.
Okay.
I guess now as you're older, when you do stuff like that, are you opening yourself up for more? Is it honoring your dead, or is it creating more for you, more of an issue?
So this is one of the things, like if you've heard the previous podcast, this is one of the things that was very confusing for me as a child, because we did not necessarily acknowledge my abilities, but then we have all these weird things that we do
Yeah.
that were totally totally hypocritical to everything. So the plate was one of them. There was something that we did with pennies, where we would leave pennies out, and it wasn't for Santa Claus. I think it was for like Saint Nikolai or Nikolai, which existed prior to Saint Nikolai. There's a whole day that, and this is very specific to my family. I don't know of other families who do this, but we have on Memorial Day, my family will go to the family cemetery and spend the day there partying.
Yeah. I don't know anybody else who does that.
And we barbecue, we play music, we do all, and you will meet family you have never met before in your life. Like I've been there with my mom before, and she'll be like, okay, you're what cousin related to what, and you came from where, and they start figuring out all the family lines. And this is something that was very confusing as a child, and to me, um, it was a very confusing message, because it's kind of like Halloween, like what we talked about is,
Yeah.
you're not okay to have abilities, but on this one day you can. But it's also a joke. Like and the next day you wake up and you're supposed to be normal again. So I wouldn't say that it was opening me up more as a child. It was just very confusing to me. And I feel like there's other children that experience that confusion with Halloween is, oh, okay, I'm not allowed to see any ghosts except on October 31st. Then all of a sudden it's okay.
Yeah.
But everyone else is telling me it's crazy and wackadoo the rest of the year. So I think that it's confusing. Now, as a teenager, yes. As a teenager, you start working in different ways. And to me, in some of the things that we did, it was no different than an Ouija board. Some of those ghost shows, I would watch those ghost shows and I would literally pull, like I literally would pull, I don't know how I did it to this day. I've had a couple other teenagers who do it as well. They will pull the spirits that the people are dealing with on the TV show right into the house.
Yeah.
And I've had two teenagers who do that on a regular basis. And I would do that. It's like an Ouija board. It's like it opens up the door to the spiritual. And then I'm pulling, not on purpose, anything and everything that'll come through. And so moments like that, even sometimes when we would go to church to honor people or be with friends and things like that, that was like a moment where the door would get opened up. As an adult, I don't really practice any of that. I acknowledge my history. Sometimes I have inklings to do things like that, but the reality is, as an adult now, the spiritual is around me all the time. I don't really, it's very rare that I will feel the need to do some type of ritual,
Gotcha. Yeah.
because it's around me all the time. I interact with it all the time. I'm at peace with it. It's just part of who I am and part of the world I function in. And I do think that that was the original intention of some of these holidays, was to kind of say, okay, rather than deal with this 365 days of the year, let's just pick one day, and that's the day we can all collectively deal with the spirit. Or, we'll pick 4 days, and those are
Right.
the days we as a society will deal with spirit, and then the rest of the days we're going to do our best to just keep them at bay. So for me, I very rarely see significance now in doing any type of rituals like that, but they also don't faze me. I'm not phased if I don't feel personally, I feel much more empowered and controlled now, which is the goal for all these children, that if they're in a house where they lay a table down or lay a plate down for an ancestor that passed, It isn't like a massive doors being drop kicked open and all this stuff's coming in. They can very much filter and be able to move on with their life.
I have one other question because you brought it up.
Okay.
As much as we could just keep doing movies. Um, let's because it's Halloween, let's do the Ouija board. Let's
Okay.
do a quick synopsis of the Ouija board and how you're feeling on it. I've used one Ouija board once. I was probably 8. I think I was 8. And it was a bunch of teenagers, and it was like, come over here, you cute thing. Let's play Ouija board. And it probably only lasted 10 minutes because the teenagers ended up getting in a fight that if it was actually working or not, or who was pushing it. Other than that, I really not had any hold on it. And I will say, as a parent, I just told my kids, like, let's not do that, because you don't know what's coming in and out. Spirit energy wise, you could be opening up something way bigger than we don't need. It's like almost like the unknown. I'm usually like good like with like open, like being questioning the unknown, but to me that, like, I always feel like it's a hard no, though I do know some intuitives really do use it as a tool.
Yep.
So what's your feeling?
My personal feeling is absolutely not, don't touch it. And that is both from working with children that have touched it and families that have touched it. But that also comes from my family history. So again, it's one of those moments that is kind of like a hypocrisy. My mom, I mean, I can remember like from a very young age, my mom saying, nope, we don't touch it. We don't, have anything to do with that. And that's because in her family, they have a huge story having to deal with darker energies and the Ouija board. And it's exactly that, not being able to control what comes in and out. Does it always go that way? No. Here's what I would say from my experience working on cases with investigators as well as individual children's and families that have used the Ouija boards. I think what happens is in a scenario where spirit finds you or an energy finds you, that's a completely different scenario than if you actively open a door, peek your head through and go, hey, I'm over here. Anyone want to answer any questions for me? And what happens is in a very physical way, you have just put a bullseye on your head. And in my experience, almost every single family and child that I have dealt with, whether it was negative to begin with or not, it becomes a very negative thing because they have now become noticeable from a spiritual point of view. So what I mean by that is when spirits come to a child, in most scenarios, they don't realize it's a child. They just see energy. They see a ball of light, especially if the child is very advanced in their thinking and their learning or have a very specific purpose for humanity. And you can get as esoteric with that as you want or as physical as you want with that. They don't really see a 9-year-old child, and they are aware to a certain degree that they're the one more trying to get the attention, and that it is unlikely they're going to be noticed. But when you use an Ouija board, it's exactly like I'm describing to you. It's like you pop your physical head up and you're like, oh, this is who I am. I have green eyes. I got long brown hair. I'm hanging out over here in this state. Come find me because I want to know answers. And suddenly you're getting flooded with stuff. And so even if it was a positive energy to begin with, because it can become very attached and wanting that conversation and wanting to, it could be getting energy or wanting to go home to the light. It could be totally innocent, just wanting a friend, wanting to be noticed, wanting to be loved, or it could be darker, wanting control, wanting power, whatever it is. By the end, it becomes a negative because it becomes attached and latched on to the family or the individual. And it is very, very, very difficult to undo that. Because once you've opened that door and said, hey, this is what my physical body looks like, it's very hard to undo that. I'm not saying it's impossible, and I'm not saying it's wrong for every family or child, but it is very, very difficult to undo it.
Does that door even close technically?
Well, I would say no.
Yeah.
You can get it in a place where it's calmer and you can function, and but your body still has the trauma of experiencing it, and that's a whole nother topic. It's one thing to spiritually experience things, but it's a whole nother thing when your physical body goes through the trauma of something. And when you use an Ouija board, that's what you're doing, is you're transferring the spiritual, that veil, you're opening that up and allowing the experience to happen in the physical, and it can be extremely traumatic to the body. And then not only do you have to deal with the spiritual abilities, but you have to deal with the physical trauma, as you know, with a few select experiences that you've had with Dominic.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing too, is what I don't think people realize, though it does happen, is it's one thing to start waiting, like you're we're already allotted for these abilities, right? So there is like kind of this progression that occurs that I'm guessing your soul is in charge of, you know, bringing you in slowly. However, if you do something like a Ouija board, like to me, that's like you standing there and being like, you can drop that giant anvil down now. I can carry that weight.
Right. And
Um,
I can't say from a divine or an
yeah,
enlightened point of view, is that necessarily wrong?
right.
No, because maybe that's what they decided when they came in, and that's the woo-woo answer to that. But from a physical standpoint, I could give a crap, because now we have to deal with all the physical trauma. And
Yeah.
that is one of the hardest things. When I have done investigations in the past, throwing away an Ouija board, like, it seems to be a lot of investigators, and this isn't to knock them, this is just not having the depth of understanding of holistic healing and psychology and things like that. It's like the idea is, we'll just move from the house or throw the Ouija board away. But it's much more complex than that, because now you've gone through a physical trauma. And in the case of an Ouija board, like you and I have said, unfortunately, a lot of times once that door is open and you've announced who you are and what you look like in the physical, it is very hard to close that door. And so the potential for more trauma building up is there.
Yeah.
It's very heavy and very intense.
Yeah. And I think that is a huge point that people with highly intuitive children would understand, because we have contacts with people who don't or aren't there yet, or those children are coming. There is a physical pain
Yeah.
with this that comes with this, and there is trauma, like and as a parent, I've talked about it on podcasts, and I kind of one aspect have described it as like my child being branded by nothing,
Right.
by there's literally a physical pain that can occur, um and then to not know where it's coming from and not know how to fix it, and then also to have people tell you that this searing pain and all these traumas, different thoughts and stuff like that aren't happening. There is. So take it seriously in this case.
Yeah. And it kind of makes me wonder in our, because we're always evolving. Evolution is still a very real thing, both in the spiritual and the physical. And it kind of makes me wonder if sometimes in the past, when people would experience pain, was there a spiritual attribute to it
Yeah.
sometimes, and doctors couldn't explain it. And now we have children who have the clairs, they can see, they can hear, and now they can directly say, no, it's coming from this timeline, or it's coming from this other part of me, or it's coming from the future. And we kind of bank them as crazy, but what if we're evolving and they're actually able to determine where these different pains are coming from, these pains that other people experience but could not be diagnosed? And so, but it is a blessing and a curse. The blessing is the child can usually, when they get older, express exactly where it's coming from and how it's hitting them. The curse is, what can you do?
Yeah.
Like, especially as a parent, it's such a helpless place to be.
Yeah. Until I mean, because you're still experienced stuff like that.
Hmm.
Um, the discernment helps.
Discernment and knowing what's in your control and not in your control.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
So that does hugely help.
And I find in my experience, particularly with teens, but also with adults, it's harder with children, but even with myself, once you have an understanding, like once you move beyond that era of thinking your child's crazy or them going through the motions of I'm just crazy, and you move into a place of just accepting this is the reality, then you can start getting understanding and understanding these different rhythms and patterns and developing coping mechanisms for
Yeah.
each pattern and rhythm.
Yes.
Truly, a lot of times for me and for some of these teens is as soon as they get the understanding and they go, oh, okay, I know what this is, I've experienced this before,
Yes.
I know
Yes.
what it's connected to, I just need to relax now, it's
Yes.
going to roll through, and it does. The
Yep.
body stops tensing and freaking out and it just rolls
Yep.
through, and then they go, oh, okay, that's what I needed to know, or this is where it needed to come, where it came from, and this is what I'm going to do with it.
Yep. I need to take a shower. I need to shower this. Or I need to lay 17 ice packs on top of myself. I need, like,
Mm.
seriously, it gets crazy. Like, but
Right.
it does. Or I need to have 5 glasses of water, and it does. There comes a point where it really does work. But, it's just like in anything, like being an adult. Yeah.
Right.
You have to find everybody's looking for the coping mechanisms that somebody wants to tell them, but they're all different.
Yes, they're all unique and authentic. And that's why I say to you, referencing back to earlier, the clairs don't really matter. They matter for learning and understanding, but
Yeah.
in the actual physical of everyday living, it's changing and adapting at such a rate. Everything you experience is going to be a different clair in a different way, and how you cope with it is a different way. And there are rhythms and patterns. So I don't want you to feel like you're on this roller coaster that's never going to end. Eventually, there will become stability through understanding those rhythms and patterns. But no, it's more about exactly like you said. And in the beginning, it can be really wild. 17 ice packs, 5 glasses of water,
Yeah.
complete darkness in one room.
Yep.
But once they do it, they're able to roll right through it. And an hour or 2 hours later, or a couple hours later, they're good to go.
Yep. We need to have we're going to do a episode about this.
Okay.
We're touching on it now. We touched on it now because this episode's already too long, but they're always too long.
Sorry.
I don't care. Um, we're gonna do an episode about this and an episode about grounding,
Yeah.
and so
Crystals and protection.
crystals and protection and grounding, and then this specific,
And maybe way in the future, a Star Wars episode.
and then a Star Wars episode.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'm going to end it here.
Okay.
And yeah. So thank you so much for doing this with me and doing the future one so we can tackle some big questions that I keep seeing.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, anytime.